Hello, everyone. Welcome to our conversation on race. This one is about colorism. It's running from 5 to 7. I'm going to turn it over to our newest commissioner and my facilitator, Castella Copeland, in just a moment, but I want to introduce you to all our commissioners. Myself, I'm the chair. My name is Judge Kevin Washington. Patricia Mack is the vice chair. Castella Copeland is our secretary. Joshua Morrow, Becky Jacobson, Joyce Armstrong, who's on with us, Lynn Sway, Byron Bob, and Kareem Mural are all commissioners. Our partners are First Church of Windsor, Grace Church, as well as Archer Memorial so far. I feel this conversation is relevant because it affects all people of color. In my own family, I have European Caucasians, and I found it strange sitting at the Thanksgiving table one Thanksgiving and how the hues just go up from the bottom up. And I remember when I pledged my fraternity as well, how they were talking about how color a paper bag, if you were darker than the paper bag, you couldn't pass, or that kind of stupid scenario. And I know Alpha Kappa Alphas had the same thing going, and Deltas. And these were primarily African-American fraternities and sororities, the Divine Nine. So it goes on within the culture. So I found it quite interesting, and I thought this would be a pertinent conversation to have, because I know it not only goes on in the African-American community, but it also goes on in the Asian community, in the Muslim community, with the caste system, in the Hispanic and Latino communities, and all. So it's a topic, that needs to be discussed. And I know even Italians have, this thing about if you're a lighter Italian or if you're a darker Italian and that kind of thing. So it is a valued topic. But with that, I'm going to make some announcements at the end. This is our last conversation on race for 2021. We will be breaking in December, and we'll start a whole new series starting 2022 in January. But I will make some further announcements when we get to the end. And I thank you all for being here, and our participants and our young people. I am so overjoyed at our young people here tonight. And I wish you would give yourselves a pat on the back and a round of applause. I thank you very much. And a special thanks to Ms. Lillian Hutchinson with Loomis Chafee. I really appreciate your efforts. I cannot say to you how pleased I am that you're here. And I'm going to make you a commissioner soon. But for now, now you're in the role that Cassie was in. And then I finally got her to be a commissioner. So I'm moving. And then you'll get the 3 a.m. in the morning emails. Okay, yeah. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Cassie to introduce our panelists and our young people, and then we'll just get into it and more in depth. And please feel free to put questions in chat or raise your hand or whatever. Hey, Cass, take over.
Awesome, thank you. So before I show a brief 7-minute film snippet, we got lots of students and panelists here today. We're just going to each give like a couple minutes about ourselves as to what brought us here and why we're doing the work that we're doing. So I'll start. My name is Castella Copeland, or you can call me Cassie. And what brought me here today is not only Judge for being on the commission, but I'm truly passionate about educating others. I'm a teacher at the Academy of International Studies Elementary School, so I truly enjoy teaching people of all ages. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. And I'm going to pop it on over to Pauline. What brought you here today?
You brought me here today. No, I'm joking. That's not true. You two brought me here today. Well, thank you so much for bringing me into that space. I'm a graduate student, PhD student at UConn's NEAG School of Education. I also work at UConn's African American Cultural Center. I am a UNESCO youth representative. I'll be traveling to Africa in a few weeks by invitation of the United Nations. It's pretty cool. And I mean, this work, my mom was, and I'm from Brazil. So really what brought me here, I guess, was the fact that I am from one of those families in which, colorism and skin tone has always been part of like the tensions, the family tensions. And my mom, being a dark skinned black woman from Brazil, there was a lot that went into that. And how was it that I was treated differently when I went out with my father, who was, lighter skinned, white passing, and when I went out with her, right? So that kind of like really was one of the things that kind of got me into this conversation very early on without my even asking. But I guess I'll pass the baton to the next person because otherwise I'll just talk forever. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Pauline, and can't wait to have such rich conversations today. Lillian, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure. My name is Lillian Castillo de Hutchinson, and this is my 20th year of living in Windsor. I'm a transplant. I teach at the Loomis Chaffee School, and I'm the Associate Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as teach Spanish, coach, track, all sorts of things as we do in boarding schools. What brings me here is very similar to Pauline. My family's ranges every single shade in the rainbow, and these are conversations that we've had. I've also had the good fortune to have a lot of friends and travel around the world, and so colorism is probably the most important topic for me, because it does deal with race and racism, but also that internal perspective that we tend to overlook sometimes. And so it is one of those things that we see it completely, and I experience it every day because I'm the darker side of my siblings, and my nicknames go with the darker side of my siblings. They are very much white passing, and yet they're 100% Hispanic. And so in my community, it's something that we see every single day. And I see, as a teacher, I see it in my students as well. Some of that unconscious bias that goes on in our classrooms with very well-meaning people, we do see that a lot. And so it's something that I think should be at the forefront of us as educators and community members in a town as diverse as Windsor. So.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Lillian. All right, I'm going to pass it on over to Adriana next. Share a little bit about yourself.
Hello, thank you, Cassie. Well, my name is Adriana Sowell. I'm a recent graduate from UConn with an individualized major in sociomedical sciences. And what brings me here today is, first, Cassie invited me, so I had to come, definitely. Also, I'm the founder and president of TNBC, so National Black Cooperative. And what brings me here today is the discussions I'm very engaged in discussions on race and racism. Like, a lot of my studies have to deal with that. And I think something that's very interesting about colorism, of being like a offshoot or a manifestation of racism, is that colorism manifests in very different ways, especially when you talk about in-group versus like out-groups. Like in-group, thinking about how like colorism in a lot of ways is relative to who you are. Like you can be the darkest person in the room compared to whoever is in the room, and that can change based on different things and how you're socialized via your family, and how your family has shaped your view of like who's dark skin, who's light skin, just based on who's in your family. So I think it could be a very fruitful conversation to talk about like how that manifests itself in group, and how that has like different psychological effects that manifest, with coping mechanisms that perpetuate the problem. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Adriana. All right, now I know we have lots of student spotlights, so they're going to give us a bit of their experiences as well. So I'm going to hop on over to a couple more of our students and other folks here. So Zach, want to start us off? Who are ya?
Sure. Hi, I'm Zach Mega. I am a member of TNBC. I was invited here by Costella. I'm a recent graduate of University, and I'm currently doing digital marketing at the Huntington Theater Company here in Boston. I'm originally from Connecticut and got involved with TNBC about 2 years ago now. And yeah, just happy to be here, hoping to learn some stuff, and it's nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. All right, now I'm going to head on over to Angelina. Would you like to share a bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Angelina. I'm a student at the Loomis Chafee School. And on campus, I am one of the presidents of Palante, which is our Hispanic affinity group. And what brought me here today was because of we spoke a lot about colorism and the unconscious bias in our own community, specifically the Latino community, where being dark skinned could be a problem, or being really pale and white passing could also be a really big part of that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing. All right, I'm going to move on over to Inari.
Hi, everybody. My name is Inari. I also go to Loomis. On campus, I am a DEI intern, which means I work alongside Ms. Hutchinson a lot. And also, I am a PRISM president, our multicultural organization on campus. And so through those conversations within those groups, I've really been exposed to colorism. I'm mixed and have always been able to visit my mom's family more than my dad's. So I've always just kind of been the Black child in my family and really didn't get that exposure to colorism and, the even more layers to racism until recently. So that's what brings me here today, is just really tapping into that recently and how that works, within my own community. I think that's really fascinating. So yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Woo, we're mixed too. So we're going to have I know we're going to have such a great conversation. Everyone's here is so amazing. And finally, last but not least, Sage. Share about yourself, Sage.
Hello, I'm Sage. I'm a student at Windsor High School. And what brings me here today is I'm just looking forward to have a conversation with you all. And just as a person, growing up, you try to learn to love yourself and learn the skin, your skin color. And I know that it's sometimes hard for certain people because they don't know how to love themselves or love their skin tone because of this colorism, and how Lillian said it's an internal thing. We grow up to looking at, oh, should we it's bad to be dark skinned and it's good to be light skinned, if you're white passing. So I'm interested in having a conversation with you all and engage. So thank you, Casella.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, Sage. And our penultimate, Corey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Corey. I'm a senior at Loomis Chafee. I actually absolutely love attending there. And I am a PRISM president as well as Inari, as well as I'm also a president of the Brothers in Unity, which is basically a affinity group for Black men on campus. So we discuss a lot of racism, colorism, everything kind of in between there. And so there we basically, I guess that sparked a lot of my interest in colorism topics and basically discussing that with the group. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, everybody. So at this point, I'm going to now share my screen and we're going to watch a super short film snippet. I know I'm very visual, so we can all start to create a common ground in which we can have a conversation on colorism. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Awesome. All right. And this is from Good Morning America. So let's sit back and watch.
Face, the bias of skin tone. It's called colorism, and it's an eye-opening topic, and covering it was championed by a member of our GMA team. We recently lost producer Daisha Riley.
Yeah, this is such an important story, and Daisha felt that it was really important to shine a light on this problem that is so recognized in communities of color, but rarely discussed publicly. Deborah Roberts is here with more on this story. Good morning, Deborah.
Good morning, Cecilia and Michael. And I have to say that I am humbled and honored to bring forth one of the last pieces that Daisha produced for us. Once again, a provocative issue, many that I've had an opportunity to explore with her over the years. And this one shining a light on bias around skin tones, not among different ethnic groups, but within the same communities of color. Some call it white privilege.
She's pretty for a dark-skinned girl.
Their parents will call me negro, which means black in Spanish.
It's been an open secret for generations.
There's this fetishization of light skin.
It was always black or white. Don't get too black.
Colorism, prejudice based on skin tone, and a preference for light skin over dark. The unfortunate phenomenon spread across all groups of color.
within Asian Americans this model minority mindset to distance yourself from other people of color by positing yourself as like the most like hardworking and law-abiding minority in this country in a way in order to kind of like gain favor with white people.
Dr. Joy DeGruy, who studies racial trauma, says colorism is rooted in proximity to whiteness.
The whole notion that white is the best, the correct, the most intelligent, the most right about everything. And as you move along the color spectrum, of the darker you are, the less important, beautiful, viable, capable, all of those things that the society has imposed upon us based on that notion of supremacy.
Its impact woven into American society and can affect every aspect of life. Take a look at the differences in wages for a dark-skinned African-American, a brown-skinned, and a light-skinned African-American. The study showing hourly wages among Blacks literally rising as skin tone lightens. Lighter-skinned minorities viewed as more intelligent by employers, even with identical education as their darker-skinned counterparts. Experts say these examples of colorism have long-lasting effects of both mental and physical trauma.
The anti-Blackness started with this whole idea that the darker you are, the less human you are. And so everyone's distancing themselves from that. I think multi-generational trauma is evident.
I hated the way I looked. I just wanted to like scratch the dark skin out of my face. One time I was in the bathtub and I wanted to stay in longer so my skin color could get lighter. I just thought that's how it worked.
Anti-colorism organizations like the Beauty Well Project in Minnesota work to end the stigma against darker-skinned people of all races who face discrimination from society as well as their own communities.
I know I was not alone. I know I'm not the only dark-skinned girl that has been bullied. You know, so we need more dark-skinned girls and boys to speak out.
Colorism sparking a lot of conversations lately, even highlighted in a best-selling novel, The Vanishing Half. Here are some statistics that Daisha was able to uncover. Darker-skinned girls 3 times more likely to be suspended from school. Darker-skinned drivers more likely to be even arrested or pulled over. A big problem that we obviously need to do a lot of work on. Cecilia?
It is, Deb. Thank you. We're going to start right now by talking about it. That's the first step. So let's bring in Anira Adway from the Beauty Well Project in Minnesota, an organization that empowers people to embrace their identity and culture. Anira, good morning to you. Thank you so much for being here to talk about, as we say, this really important topic. This is something that exists for Latinos. This is something that exists for Asian Americans, African Americans, so many groups of color. What can we do to combat this?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Colorism is so much embedded in cultures. It's something that started with colonizations, those countries that experienced colonizations, and also communities that have experienced slavery. And so it's deeply rooted in cultures. We have to teach people their identities. We have to teach people their history. We need to redefine beauty standards because that is a huge issue that impacts these communities. We need to empower and uplift communities of color.
No doubt. And Amira, how can people of color overcome their own insecurities and biases?
Yeah, this is so much trauma. I mean, this has been going on for years and years and years. So people are dealing with so much trauma, so much pain, and so they need safe space. We have to create safe space for them. We have to listen to them. A lot of times people don't disclose what they're experiencing unless they have safe space. So we have to create these safe spaces for them. We have to empower very early on. We have to start empowering young girls. That's why it's so important to have mentoring programs. Young people have to see representations in all fields. For example, journalism. They have to see people of color in all of these places that really represent them. And that representation, it's so empowering, and that helps with their mentoring, and that helps them see that they can do whatever they want.
That's why we say representation matters so much. So let's talk about the next generation because we want them to do better. Quickly, if you will, how do we address colorism at an early age?
Yeah, early age, during early childhood, it's so important to intervene, and that is when we really need to reform school curriculums. We need to include young young kids in the school curriculums.
Well, hey there, GMA fans. Robert.
All right. And then if you want, you can check out some more of the film snippet online. It's called People of Color Discuss the Impact of Colorism for the full interview, but just to have a little common ground. And I also have some additional snippets that I'll be sharing with you all later on if you'd like to continue your education on how colorism impacts a lot of different folks. So I know we already did our introduction of panelists. I'm going to briefly go through, like this should take roughly 5-10 minutes. I'm going to go through a couple slides so we can all have a little more understanding and knowledge. So when we have this conversation with one another, speak from the I, so speak from your own experience and listen to and understand one another. We all have such beautiful identities and beautiful backgrounds, and they're so different from one another. And that's okay. So we can kind of listen to understand each other's perspectives and lean into discomfort and feelings, because I might have something that's different from my culture than your culture, and it might make me feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. I want to learn more about that. Confidentiality, so all the lessons that we learn here, we'll get to leave into our communities, but the stories with the names and more specificity stay here. Being respectful online, that looks like staying muted while others are talking. You can raise your hand, you can type in the chat, and participate and converse with each other. So I see this event as a challenge by choice. Whatever you put into it, you will get out of it as well. So however much you would like to participate and feel comfortable to, I highly encourage you to. And finally, agree to disagree with grace, because it's okay for all of us to have different opinions, different ideas, but we can do so with grace and still have amazing conversations with each other. And if anyone at any time would like to add anything throughout the event, feel free to type in the chat and we can add additional expectations. But does this look good to everyone? Just give me a thumbs up if it looks good as like a good starting point. Excellent. All right, here's our brief agenda. We're going to kind of, again, give some context. I'm going to go over some salient points. We're going to have some questions with all of our students and panelists and everyone here. And then finally, we're going to have an audience Q&A. And then we'll have closing thoughts and feelings, including some amazing resources that students have provided, that TNBC has provided. And it's just, I think it's going to be amazing at the end. So the purpose of the event today here is to converse with one another on what colorism is and reflect on the changes that we can make in our community by starting with ourselves. So I always highlight that when we go into each of these events, it is a conversation. I'm not looking to change who you are. I'm not looking to change anything about you, really. I just want to have a conversation with you all. And hopefully from these conversations, we can learn more about what actions that we can take in our communities. So as we learned in the video, we learned about what colorism is, but here it is again, just so we can have more of an explicit understanding. So colorism is prejudice or discrimination against people based on relative lightness or darkness of their skin. And we can see this across cultures. I know personally, I've seen this when I traveled to the Dominican Republic, when I've traveled to Korea and South Africa. It is very present in every single country that I've ever visited so far. I think it is a global phenomenon. And in the next few slides, we're going to kind of see some visual examples. So I know that we have a couple of studies that indicate some of the countries, but we can also see within a lot of different cultures, such as Southeast and Southwest Asian cultures, such as Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, and India, and that section of the world. You can see their skin lightening. We can also see this in Latinx countries, Hispanic countries, and more Southern America or the Pacific Islander countries. And so here's some statistics on experiences with discrimination, more common for Hispanics with darker skin. And we're also going to talk later on about the difference between Black American versus like Hispanic, and how there is this kind of overlap in identity, and how here in America, and I know myself included, sometimes people confuse the two. So here's some statistics on that. And finally, here are some salient points for colorism. Again, this is not all inclusive. There's so much to unpack with colorism. There are actually entire courses, lectures, books, all about colorism. So this is, again, just a very brief synopsis on colorism and how it is a global phenomenon that favors lighter skinned Black, Indigenous people of color over darker skinned people of color. So there's a lot of literature, well documented from, I want to say the 1500s onwards, as to where we can see this. And it is not just an issue for people of color, but it's an issue across all parts of identity. I know I'm a part of the LGBTQ community and I see it there as well. Or I'm a part of, like, I'm an athlete, I see it there as well. So this shows up across identities that are interlocking. And finally, it can be experienced not just around the world, but we can see this here in Windsor, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And finally, here's some key terms. If you are super interested in learning more of the intricacies of colorism, you will see some of these terms go around and you'll see their clickable links. So if you want to read some more about the literature, I know I'm a super nerd as a teacher. I'm like, oh, here's some readings, everyone. So if you want, you can read some more about it. Exoticism, fetishization, objectifying, texturism. You may hear some of our panelists use these words, or you may see these come up often and frequently in discussions on colorism. So again, there are ample resources on it. I'm going to highlight this quote by Janice Asare, which says, within communities of color, fetishization can look like the glorification of lighter skin, colorism, and more Eurocentric featureism, as well as hair discrimination, texturism. And again, we're going to get to talk about how colorism impacts people's perceptions and evaluations of beauty later on. All right, and now enough of me talking. So we're going to get to our panelists here and students. So here's our first question. I'm going to stop my screen share here. But our first question for panelists, which I'm going to type in the chat as well, is, in your own words, how would you describe what colorism looks like in your communities? All right, so again, you can share as much or as little as you want. And if I have any panelist volunteers that would like to start off, just give me a thumbs up and I can call on you. Go ahead, Pauline, start us off.
Yeah, I really don't have a problem talking all the that's the thing that I love doing. Okay, so I think that, to me, and we all agreed on speaking from our own perspectives and our perspectives only, because I guess that's all I know, right? In terms of so to me, the way I could describe colorism is the fact that, coming from a multiracial, I guess, biracial family, if you will, it was very evident to me growing up and going to family events to see the white members of the family sitting on one side of the room and the Black family members sitting on the other side of the room. To me, I always question, why is it that the white folk have more of an affinity and the Black folk have more of an affinity, right? I then grew up, of course, to be an adult, to learn that was called colorism, right? And it's not of an affinity, but I guess it's an affinity sort of imposed by this thing called, white supremacy, right? So there's a set of values that folks establish in order to defend a particular group as if they were better than other groups. So in my case of my family, that's what really brought me to understand colorism, visually speaking, right? The fact that there's a spectrum of folks, different complexions, and that usually it can get pretty segregated based on that, right? And usually the white folks involved in my community got away with more than the darker skin or Black folks. That's how I lived and understood colorism. Now, yeah, that's my experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Pauline. I know I can have a lot of personal connections with that as well. Any other panelists? Lillian, go out and ahead. We'll go to Lillian. Go ahead.
I think, my students know this story quite well. I was exposed to colorism. Granted, I didn't know it was colorism until I became an adult. Early on, my great-grandmother was from a very well-established family, European descendant in Honduras. And she was cut off and disowned by her family. because she fell in love with a man who was indigenous Mayan descendant, who didn't have money. Right then and there, that's 2 strikes, to the point that none of her 8 siblings were allowed to go to her wedding. One of them left the house and did it hiding, and went to the wedding. And I remember, this is probably my youngest memory as a kid. I was probably around 2 or 3, my aunt says. And we were sitting on the porch of the house in Honduras, and my great grandmother's braiding my hair. And she's telling me how it was her greatest regret that she had not given my grandfather the respect and the love that he deserved, because he didn't have money and he was Mayan, versus a European descendant. And so that stuck with me a long time. And I, growing up, I am the darker, one of the darkest in my family. Well, in my immediate family, like I said, we tend to have the span of spectrum. But even my nickname, similar to the clip actually that kind of hit home, is Negrita. And I've never balked at it. I'm negra número 2 because my aunt is older, so she's the number 1, and my younger sister is number 3. But it hit home again when I was a brand new teacher at Loomis, and I had my cell phone there, and I left my cell phone, and someone had called me, and my like call line on my screen was Negrita. That was my screen. If someone came in, and someone felt offended that was there and that I had that name. And so I saw it the other way, where someone, a person of color, was offended because I had that nickname, even though it's been my nickname for as long as I can remember. And so I've seen it on both sides. And it's one of those things that in my family, they're very good about talking about it, because we have every single shade known to man. But it is always really hard, because even though we can talk about it, it's still really shocking to my siblings, who will then see how I'm treated versus how they're treated. And they'll get either really upset or not see it at all. And so you see this juxtaposition throughout, and that's kind of been my entire life growing up, wherever I've been, so.
Absolutely. And I know I can personally relate to that as well, like especially within school communities, or seeing how it plays out, like the other nicknames people give to you. I'm like, I didn't ask for that, and then having to deal with the side effects. So thank you so much, Lillian, for sharing. Hey, Jenna, I know you wanted to share next.
Yes, so I kind of picking off the back with both Lillian and Paulina. I think is, well, first I want to say that like I identify as like a Black woman of both Jamaican and African American descent, because my mom is Jamaican and my dad's African American. And I think it's important to start there too, because like identifying race as a social construction that becomes real through social realities and the social phenomenon that is racism, and how your ethnicity is something that's very different, something that's based in culture and based in shared norms and cultural references based off of that community itself, and how those two intersect. So thinking about like color, so then going on to think about colorism, right? So you think about, as Paulina said, racism is a manifestation of white supremacy, right? And the way I think about colorism is like an offshoot or a symptom of that racism, right? It's a tool of white supremacy in order to further the subjugation of Black and brown people. And I think it's important when we talk about colorism to think about the intersections on which like colorism works, right? So speaking from like my mom's perspective, I remember growing up that she would talk about her kind of like, now like looking back, I can see it as probably trauma that she was talking about, but just like her experiences as a child, like she had 5 siblings, and feeling that her parents calling her like darky and things like that, and like looking at it now and realizing that like relative like to our immediate family, my mom and dad and my sister, she's like probably the lightest one of all of us, and thinking of like, wow, how colorism it exists on a micro level, but it exists on the macro level too, like how colorism is relative to who is the darkest person in the room and who people deem as being the darkest person in the room at that time, but also on a macro level, how we have the wide spectrum of what is dark, what is light, and what is in the middle, and what's that spectrum looks like. So I think it's also important to like attach that to like texturism, featureism. So like, yes, you may be light skinned, but what is the texture of your hair and how does that combine? What are your features? You may be light skinned, what do your features look like? Do you have like unambiguously Black features, but you're still light skinned? And how does that change the system and change the structure and change how you navigate and experience the world? And I think there was a quote that I in one of my classes I took that I learned about, and was talking about how there's this idea of being like perpetually white and be perpetually Black, and like what exists in between. And I think it gets back to remembering how colorism is, again, a manifestation of white supremacy, right? The goal is to keep the marginalized divided so that they are not able to work together, right? So to be able to put these people on the spectrum and give certain wages of privilege, like differential privileges that you're not white, you don't have the privileges of being white, but you have a differential privilege based on compared to your other brothers and sisters that are darker because of the systems and structures in place that perpetuate colorism and make it so that colorism is like a salient or a make colorism salient, right, in the real world, like make it so that certain people do not have access to certain things based off of them being lighter, being more closer to your section features. And I just quickly to close, I think something my mom, I really appreciate her for is that I think out of that trauma, a coping mechanism, like in unconscious coping mechanism she may have like formed was like making sure that I was like very pro-Black. So she had like essence subscriptions. We made like collages of like all the different Black people. Like she made it very clear when I had like I wanted Barbie, she made sure I would buy Black Barbies. Like she will not like buy one. So like there was like a very conscious like effort to make sure that like I understood that like I'm important, that this is like in very appropriate, like age appropriate ways throughout my life to make sure like Black is beautiful, Black is important in every way that it comes in, and almost to the point that like I would view like darker skinned people as like maybe even more beautiful than just like the stereotypical, just because of how much you reinforce that topic to me. So I think it's important to like, and just also acknowledge that micro like change also is not indicative of macro change. Like we still have to do the work to really to impact the macro level too. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Adriana. I really like how you're talking about like almost like there's this monetization of like how we perceive one another and how that changes based off of culture and our own identities and those around us. And ultimately we're trying to find that sense of belonging with like within our families, cultures, and ourselves. So thank you so much for sharing. Any students like to share as well? Go ahead, Inari.
I think for me, I love, well, not love, I guess it's mixed feelings, but it's interesting to hear about everybody's experiences within their own families. Just because, again, like I said, that my experience really didn't happen until I was outside of my family. But for me, when I think about like the communities that I've been in and experiencing colorism, I think about like middle school when I was first, because I went to elementary school at a private school. So I was with a lot of white kids. And then I finally was in middle school in Springfield, which is where I live. And I was with all Dominican kids, Haitian kids, Jamaican kids, and we had like 2 white kids in our class. So what we were dealing with wasn't racism. Our issue was always colorism. And so when I look back, I think about it's just these little subtle things. Like whenever kids who are dark skinned, they're feeling themselves, they say things like, "Oh, I'm feeling light skinned," and that's the thing that I still hear today. Like I'm sure anybody else in here who's like younger, that's something that everybody hears. So those little things that are so ingrained that we don't even realize are an issue, I don't think. But those ideas about just lighter being more attractive, I think that's how it really manifests for us, is that lightness is more attractive, or it's more feminine, especially when it comes to being a light-skinned girl. Seeing that play out in like my interaction with boys my age, that really opened my eyes to colorism, especially coming into high school. So just think about that and the fetishization track of it. That's really what has opened my eyes as of late. But yeah, that's a weird line that I've really only recently opened my eyes to. I noticed the whole like light skin is more attractive, light skin is better thing. But the weird fetish and line of it is really what I've been noticing lately.
Absolutely. And how we can see that on social media too, and like Instagram, and how it's like continuously, it's the small moments where all the small moments trickle down into a larger river and waterfall. And before you know it, it's an issue, right? I see Judge, then Angelina.
Yeah, I just wanted to make two points here. This isn't something that just started, in recent history. This is something that began in the fields, in the plantation fields, where, the master had the light-skinned girls in the house and the darker-skinned slaves were in the field. So this is not something that we just started on, in recent history. This has been going on since we landed here. Whether you're Caribbean or Hispanic or African, whatever your diaspora is, it's not something brand new. The second point I wanted to make is that it affects us in the legal field as well. As a Black federal judge, which I can count on my one hand how many of us are African American, they question our decisions and why did you do this? And then on the other side of that, then you have the sentencing part where darker skinned people of color, are sentenced harder than lighter skinned people. So that's also a part of it's not only, in regular society, it goes on in the front of judicial system and in the back of the judicial system. That's all I want to say.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for giving us that perspective, Judge. Angelina?
Yeah, I just want to talk about a little bit about how colorism affects my community. I'm a Mexican American. I'm not originally from Windsor, but I'm from Brooklyn, New York. And at home, I've experienced a lot of colorism, especially from my mom and my dad. Especially through the summer where I get really tan compared to how I get in the winter. They love to bring up how dark I get, and they're like, oh, you look so much better lighter. I've dealt with that a lot at home, but I never really put the word to it. And going to Loomis and learning about colorism and all about these topics, I finally understood what colorism was. And it bothered me a lot to know that it came from my own parents, that demonization of having darker skin. And they at one point called me Pakistana, Pakistani, because of how dark I got. And it bothered me, and I was just because my parents are extremely a lot lighter than I am, and it bothered me to know that this was a deep-rooted problem. I had to understand these were ideals that they were taught and they were accustomed to. So I've had conversations like these with my parents, and we've come to terms with how colorism affects our family specifically. Yeah, I've also grown up at a public school in New York where it was mainly Latinos and Hispanics. We didn't really have a lot of African Americans or Asians or white people. So when I finally came to Loomis, which is a predominantly white institution, I finally saw colorism come into play, especially in the classrooms where I've sort of seen my white teachers favor white students more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, Angelina.
Cassie, if I may, to add to Angelina's point, one of the things that we see in the Latina Hispanic community is colorism since the get-go. For the first indigenous woman to grace the cover of Mexican Vogue, which is the Vogue of Latin America, that didn't happen until 2019 with Yalitza. And so, we've always been presented, to Angelina's point, we've always been presented these other extremes. And to Pauline's, comments, we've been given these other images to aspire to versus realizing the beauty that we have within. And so I really appreciated Adriana's comments, because we need to do that self-love too,
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, everyone. All right, and Zach, Sage, or Corey, would you like to add on anything for this question?
Yeah. Oh, Zach, do you want to go first?
You can go first.
Okay, so definitely I want to say thank you all for sharing. Like I loved your story. Like I was so engaged. It's like thank you. But I want to say like with the colorism thing, it's really like the microaggressions. And I think you guys were kind of mentioning it in all your stories. And like even recently, like I'm at school, like one of my friends, he was saying, oh, I prefer like light-skinned girls. Like, you know, I like the light-skinned girls. And what he said after that though, he was saying, but I don't really like the dark-skinned girl. Like he made sure he like kept on saying that and repeating it. And it just like made us feel like me and my friends feel like, why are you saying that? Like, you know, why are you trying to put us down? Like, you know, you might prefer something and that's great, but like, don't put our, you know, color down, right? So that's what I started thinking about. It's just like those microaggressions and how sometimes we don't notice it because it's just been going on forever, you know? So I feel like for me, like growing up, like I got suckered into that. I'm like telling my mom, like during the summer, I'm getting dark, you know, and I get upset. I'm just like, I want to stay inside. I don't want to get dark because I know I'm going to be judged when I get back to school. And they're like, oh, Sage, you got dark. So it's just, I'm glad you guys mentioned that because I think that's something that's been going on for way too long. And like you said, it's like self-love, like we need to change that. And yeah, that's what I just wanted to share.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing, Sage. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I think Sage is right. And the fact that it has been going on for a long time, I think colorism is something that, you know, through generations from like very explicit racism, like I think the judge had brought up earlier. And now it's one of those things that is so deeply entrenched in people's minds that they barely notice it. I feel like conversations around colorism are really important because if you didn't notice it, it's very easy to notice it once you start having the conversations and once you hear people talk about how much it affects them on their day-to-day basis. It's really upsetting, I think, because it does pit people of the same culture against each other, and it's something that they've been pitted against each other from like outside forces, and you know, once again, it's weird because it's not one of those things that's as explicit as racism. It's not just you know, pure hatred all the time. A lot of the time I feel like colorism comes in the forms of jokes and like lightheartedness, and I've seen it in my own family as well. And it's not always intended to be mean or to be put down, but it ends up affecting people. And it kind of reinforces maybe something that's going on internally. And, you know, it's, I don't know, more minute than just being hated for your skin all the time. But if it keeps happening, then it's gonna affect you mentally. And beauty standards are something that's so widespread, and I feel like people reinforce them without even thinking about it. And so it's important to have the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I know, as Lillian was saying before too, it's like it's this internal aspect or the self-talk that we say to ourselves, and then you just start to believe it, and then and then that impacts how we treat ourselves, and then ultimately how we treat others around us. So thanks so much for sharing, Zach.
Absolutely. Like, yeah, Casella, unfortunately, I think it's not just our internalization, it's also in looking at this from a global perspective, colorism is a billion-dollar industry, right? We have bleach agents, we have creams, we have, I mean, just everything, right? And so to make it whiter is better. And so there is this perpetuity to it that's not even something that is just ingrained to us or said on the sly, but something that is literally has the economic backing across the board, across generations and globally. And so it's one of those things that it's like, it feels like Sisyphus, right? Like we're going up against the current, and that rock just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And are we ever going to get to the top? And so I think that these conversations are really important in order to be able to understand where can we break it, right? Where can we start realizing that it doesn't really matter? And so I appreciate, you know, the panels and the panelists for doing that.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. I see Judge and Adriana would like to share.
Yeah, I just wanted to pose a quick question to the young people as well, primarily to the young men. I want to know, I think this is a more acute problem with females than there is with males. Do you feel that it's a gender thing, that more females are looking into whitening skin and brightening skin, and men are not? Do you think that it goes on that it's separated more acute in one gender than the other? And I'd like to pose that question to Zach and Corey.
I kind of think there's like two different ways. Like, I guess like it's almost like two different fights. So I think like at least what I see with a lot of my friends who are men, they're typically, it's more, I guess, saying like, oh, like light skin versus dark skin, especially in Black communities, but they're not necessarily going out of their way to change anything. So it's more like a joking kind of manner, where I think that on the other end, there is sometimes action taken, which is kind of where the difference is. So I think like a lot of times for us, it's just like, I guess, if you feel uncomfortable, like with, if you want to say, I want to be more light skin, I guess a lot of times I'll find a lot more camaraderie from people around me to kind of make sure that I'm in the right mindset. Whereas I don't know if there's necessarily the same thing on the other end, as much kind of preventing people from taking those measures, since especially for women, I noticed that there's a lot more pressure for them to become lighter, whereas there's not as much like mass media marketing for men on that same kind of, I guess, like skin changing. So.
Yeah, I think I agree with Corey 100%, especially on the last point. I think this might be something that affects women more, strictly because beauty standards in our culture are put heavily on women. Like it's, I think sexism plays a part in it. You know, if you want to talk about intersectionality, like I don't think there's as much pressure on, you know, me, for example, to look a certain way as it is for women. And that's just not, you know, the color of their skin per se, but it's, you know, definitely plays a part. But yeah, just in general, beauty standards for women are so much higher, and they're expected to do all these things, whether it be for the male gaze or whatever have you. So I think colorism is not so much just like the overall thing that forces them, but more as like a part of what puts so much pressure on women to look a certain way.
Thank you, Zach and Corey.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. And I see Adriana, you have your hand up. Go on ahead.
Yeah, so I had a different point, but just to build off of that quickly, I think when we talk about like the gender difference in colorism, I think it's important to point out, like, when we talk about colorism, we talk about like the span and the spectrum and light and dark. When we think about like being light as like the idea of like being closer to whiteness and like femininity and being soft and weak, versus being dark skinned, and the association or the connotation that you're stronger, you can endure all this pain and so on and so forth. And I think the beauty standards may be more so emphasized with the women, but I think for the men, I think with colorism, I think it plays into like masculinity. And we talk about like, I don't know if you guys ever heard this, but like, oh, you're draking, you're in your feelings, you're being light skinned. Like that's commentary that I hear often that is associated with like men being like, if you're light skinned, that you're emotional, that you're more like you're weaker, and these kind of that rhetoric I hear like a lot within group, you know, various ethnicities. And I think, and then you see you're dark skinned, you're like, oh, he's strong, he's going to keep it together. And I think when it comes to like the gender difference, I think with males, it comes more so into like talking about like how masculinity manifests itself and like how they see themselves via that. And then going back, Liliana and Zach, you guys, like, I think the ethos of the conversation, we're talking a lot about like, this is not new, this has started like well beyond before. I think it's important to talk about, especially when we think about the slave trade and think about colonization, specifically when we talk about the Caribbean, because when it comes to the Caribbean, the colonizers were not able to bring, you know, as many people, right? So it was built into the system and structure so that they would procreate with enslaved people, right? And that some people, in order to keep the hierarchy, the racial hierarchy consistent, that they created this caste, almost essentially a caste system of like mestizos and people that are, you know, fully conquerors blood, partially conquerors blood, and go so forth and so on, right? So in order to keep the hierarchy, to keep the system and the structure in place. And I think when we talk, especially when we talk about like Caribbean people, when we think about like how most Caribbean countries are majority Black nowadays, and how like colorism still persists, is because of those systems, like the legacies of those systems and structures from all the way back then, how they made like to being able to be white gave you access to power, gave you access to not be a part of the enslaved class, it gave you access to being able to come out of social mobility in a lot of ways. In that time, I think you see that like progressing even today. So I think it's really important, like when we talk about colorism, to put it in like that social historical context, like how did we get here? Like, why is it so important? How has it become commodified and those kind of things? So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing. And then I see there's Pauline, Nanari, and Angelina. Go ahead. So much to share. Yay.
I know. So, well, thank you, Adriana, for bringing that up. I mean, this last summer I did research in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. I do research at what they call UNESCO heritage sites. So for some UNESCO heritage sites are really those spaces that look really preserved and that are usually, historical area right by the sea, San Juan in Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. I mean, you name it. For some, that's it. But for some of us, like I grew up at a heritage site back in Brazil, and to me, that has an entirely different understanding now. The reason why I went to the Dominican Republic was to do research on the heritage sites, but then I sat with a Black scholar there who was telling me that he told me you've been looking at the history of slave folks in Brazil and all that, and and you're sitting at my chair and telling me that there's all this really old stuff from the 17th century. He's like, you keep referencing the 17th century, but what you don't know is that some of these things, I mean, we have written notice of that happening as early as 1519, right? So when you think about Christopher Columbus, when he first stole, this, I guess, when he started stealing land in 1492, but it's as early as 1519, right? He was telling me that on that year, what happened was Christopher Columbus left Santo Domingo and went to other islands in Central America to colonize and steal more land, essentially. But he told me that what happened was that he also, of course, brought enslaved folks, not massively as later on, not in bigger numbers as later on, but it's in smaller numbers. So at that point, when Christopher Columbus leaves Santo Domingo, what happens is that enslaved folks were kind of left at their own resorts, so essentially they started to own slaves too. And there's a lot of colorism into that, right? Lighter skinned slave people and darker skinned slave. I mean, it's a very, very ancient issue. I mean, and I say that to say that number one, yes, we do. It's much older than we think. And number two, I think that there is an important thing that we need to be super, super intentional in addressing, which is class, right? I feel like oftentimes we are so caught up in like resolving, the colorism and the racism related, but like we really need to be talking about class as well, because class and race in a country, for example, I feel like in the U.S. the framework is very much about race because it's a predominantly white country, I guess, in numbers, right? But my country, for example, is a predominantly Black space, so that sort of gives us a different framework, which is considering class, right? And how class has been mattering, right, in those hundreds and hundreds of years, if you will, and that really further complicates things. And my last thing that I kind of say to wrap up this section is, the way I see it is the fact that if you hear everyone, talk about it in different ways, you will notice that number one, this has been really like centuries of trauma across multiple communities, right? And number two is really this notion that the same way we did not get to trauma alone, we will not get out of trauma alone. This is a collective thing. The same way, trauma was sort of like brought upon, Black and brown communities across Latin American countries and the Americas, really, and other places in the world where, you know, race was used to sort of justify enslavement. I think that this is everyone's business, right, in different ways. And I really think that folks need to really keep that mindset. You know, we did not get to trauma alone, and liberation is not a process that we can do alone. So really, we need to rely on the sort of like collective support system, such as this one right here. And I'm very just, you know, thankful for this space with everyone here bringing their different perspectives.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Pauline. And then before we get to 2 audience questions, I know Inari wants to share, and then Angelina wants to share. Go ahead, Inari.
Adriana did what I wanted to do, so.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, there's a lot of connections too. I love hearing about everyone's experiences and also how we relate in many different ways. Angelina?
I wanted to pose a question. Like, I've heard from my white passing friends who are Hispanic and Latino who say they've faced colorism in a way where like they've like by their darker skin counterparts have been told that they're less than because of their how like light they are. Like, I want to know if like anyone like and how anyone feels about that comment.
All right, and then I'm going to post that in the chat. I tried to get it as best as possible. There we go. Excellent. So I know we got lots of great questions here in the chat, so you can take a look. I know Lillian has one. Do they, as in men, see colorism as male in the athletic or intellectual realm versus colorism in women being a beauty standard? Marcia Hinckley shared, how does it make you feel with the double standard that white people want to go through all the efforts they do to get tan? And then finally, how do white passing Black, Indigenous people of color experience colorism, and how do folks feel about that as well? So lots of questions to sit and digest. If any panelists would like to share, Inari, want to start us off? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was wanted to respond to Angelina's question. I think it's really interesting to be someone who's so involved in this kind of work and often trying to, I guess, appeal or work with people of color. And especially for me, a lot of the different projects I've done have been for Black women. So that's kind of been my like sphere of people who I'm working with. And that's outside of school. And when I'm at Loomis and doing the work at Loomis, that's all sorts of people. But being a beneficiary of colorism, it's really interesting to think about like what the weight that my voice carries, because when I'm trying to do work that's advocating for Black women and dark-skinned women, that was kind of my own head was invalidating my own voice a lot, because I did a project where I was talking about the healthcare system and racism and the intersectionality of racism and sexism in healthcare systems and how that affects Black women, especially when it comes to giving birth and that whole crisis. So that was one of the projects I did. And while I was doing it, I was sharing the voices and the stories of Black women. But throughout that whole project, my own voice in my head was telling me, like, why are you doing this? Like, you're a light-skinned girl. Like, you're not really, this is not your fight necessarily. Like, there's always that voice in my head, like, how valid is my voice when I'm speaking on all these issues that maybe I don't even experience because of this benefit that I have. And then on the opposite side of what can I do with that, knowing that my voice means more to a white person because they have more respect for a lighter skinned person because of this idea of colorism. So it's just really troubling to think about the two sides of that coin when doing like this work specifically. But that's been my kind of experience with that.
Absolutely. And just to echo you real quick, there are nuances, because I know as a light skinned, almost like passing at times person of color, it took me over 2 decades to actually say, oh, I belong to that community, and to actually feel like, yes, I can do the work as well. So there's always nuances about your own perception and what other people perceive of you. But then at the end of the day, like, how can you still stay true to yourself and say, no, like, here is where I belong and here is who I am. So thank you so much for sharing, Inari. Adriana, I see you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. Anari, that was, first of all, that was like such a beautiful way to state it. And I'm so excited that you were like interested in health justice too, because like that is, health justice is like my core. So yeah, but and I think your point is like so extremely valid. And I think we have to also remember that to exist in like colorism works both ways. And I think that we have to also understand that like white supremacy, the purpose of like these systems and structures is to have us exist in these extremes without realizing like we're in a spectrum. Like there's not just the end, this and this, there's a spectrum of people that we all exist, and that nobody can validate your blackness but yourself, right? Like nobody else has the ability to validate, because we all, yes, we have the commonality of living in the Black experience, but that everybody has their own individual unique Black experience and the way they exist in the world now. And each experience is valid in its own way because it's their Black experience of how they exist in the world, right? And, you know, we can get into whether, you know, people that are Black and don't identify themselves as Black and those sorts of things. But like for the totality, like nobody can validate your Blackness but yourself. And I think going back over to Angelina's point about like Black people, like saying that light-skinned people are not Black because of so-and-so and colorism and this and that, I think it's important also like remember that like we are all existing in a world where we're all experiencing our own traumas. And a lot of the time it may not be you, it may be the trauma that they experienced in life and they're projecting that onto you, right? Like it may be trauma based in real reality, real experiences, real lived experiences that have hurt them internally. But them seeing you do that, it just re-manifests or re-triggers that trauma of like, oh, I remember when I was passed over for, I was equally eligible, equally had the credentials to do so, to do the same thing, but I feel like I was just passed over just because this person was more palatable, or so and so and so. So you just have to remember, like, everybody's living, existing with their traumas, and how that may manifest in society does not necessarily mean that you, like, isn't a reflection of you, but maybe a projection of like something that's what's not inside of them that they've internalized.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well said. I see Judge and then Lillian. Would like to share?
Yes. I am flattered with Adriana and Nari's comments on health, women's health. I watched this interview or documentary last night that's on Netflix about Black women and maternal health. And they were giving their, I don't know if you all have seen that, they were giving their experiences when in maternity. And I know that's a whole another different genre that we need to explore, but it's astounding how Black women are treated in maternity settings, and if they have a doula or not, you know, because there's nobody really speaking for them and their experience in childbirth. So I thought that was quite interesting. But I wanted to, and if you all want that video, that documentary information, I can send it to both of you all. To Marcia's question, I always wondered as a kid, why did white people want to be tan? If we are, you know, looked at as lesser than, I can't answer that question because I'm not a white person. What is the meaning behind wanting to be tan? Mm-hmm. Marcia, can you respond to that? Maybe I'm getting the wrong inference from your question, but I thought that was a great question.
I actually, my internet is bad, and your question to me, I couldn't hear. Would you mind repeating it?
Sure. Why do white people want to be tan? If you know, if they look at us like we're lesser than.
It doesn't make sense. I mean, when I want to get tan, it's because I think that my skin is pretty ugly because it's just so white. And then I think back of Laura Ingalls Wilder when I used to love those stories, and they were supposed to wear bonnets so that they didn't get dark. So I think that has changed some. But when you think about how many people really want to get tan and get very tan, it's hypocritical. That's the only way I can see it, because they think that it's beautiful, but if you have it naturally, there's something wrong.
Exactly. I agree with you. It's hypocrisy.
Yeah.
You know, it's at its best. So I can't come up with an answer to that question, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I just wondered how it makes you feel. You talk about microaggressions, and then you hear people talking about wanting to be darker, and yet they're making, maybe different people are making those comments, but you get the comments about, you know, how bad it is to be dark. So I would think it would be another microaggression in some cases, at least.
Exactly.
Thank you for addressing it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Kevin and Marcia. I see there's Lillian and then Anari, and then anyone else who'd like to answer the questions. You could be panelists, students, audience members. Go for it. Go ahead, Lillian.
I think one of the things, to Marcia's point, I think there is, you know, the concept of the exotic, right? The exotic is great. The exotic elevates whoever is at the core. And so it's okay in that realm, but it's not okay if you're naturally that, right? And so I appreciate the fact that you mentioned that it's not okay, right? And that it is a microaggression, because you do, like, people pay thousands of dollars in the tanning industry. And yet if I'm naturally, to Judge's point, I'm less than. I also think the issue of, how can I say this? I think that there's a lot of things that we've talked about where colorism is at the core, right? And it's not just the self and the caste system, like Cassie talked about, but it is one of those things that we think about that need to be rectified and talked about, but it also depends on who's talking about it. Because if you're not part of the chosen or the appropriate group, it's different, right? And I think about this often because I often tell my colleagues and my students that it's about where you are in your journey, right? Everyone comes at it in a different realm. And it's 2021, and the lens that we're seeing these questions with now are very different if you are 15, 25, 35, 45, 75 years old. And so I think there's a level of freedom that we have right now that you haven't been able to address certain questions before. And so there's a level of guilt, I think, also, if you are older, of like, how did I not even think about this before? And it's not a past, but I think it's really important to acknowledge and meet people where they are in their journey, because everyone is at a different stage in their journey. And the anecdotal example is, I had a faculty member at school say, I don't know if I should be a part of Palante, because even though I am mixed, white and Puerto Rican, am I going to be accepted because I look white? And so there was this level of guilt, yet because he is now, has been having these conversations, he's now married and has a child and all of these great things. He's like, I don't want my child not to go through the things that I missed out on. And I want to give my child this history back. And so it was a great example of, being able to acknowledge where they are, acknowledge where things need to be rectified. And to Anari's point, being able to say, like, you can be in multiple spaces. You don't have to just be the one thing, right? And so how you identify is really important. And we are now in 2021 and moving forward, being able to have these honest and open conversations. And so it's important to be able to then acknowledge that the journey is at different places. So that's all.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing. I saw Anari and Corey and Zach. Go ahead, Anari. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just again to Marcia's point, I think another kind of phenomenon that's happening right now is this desire to be like racially ambiguous. So we see a lot of, especially in celebrities, white women who are celebrities, this desire again, like to be exotic and also just to be disassociated from whiteness. And I think that comes from this, maybe, I don't think for all, because I don't think all of them are even on this level yet, but I think some of it comes from white guilt. They don't want to be associated with their whiteness. And a lot of it, I think a lot of the time is just this idea that we're the blueprint. We create so many of the trends that they get to profit from. So when they, are white women and they see these trends that are popular and made popular by most of the time Black women, they're like, okay, well, let me try and be like this and try to make some money off of this. And so then that means they're going to get tanned, they're going to get cornrows, and they're going to get braids, and they don't know what any of it means, but it's just profit, I think. And that's when we see it a lot. And then you have people who aren't celebrities and white girls who aren't celebrities who see that happening on that level, and then it just gets passed down. I think that's probably at least one cycle to it, but
absolutely. Yeah, and it's kind of like how racism and capitalism really feed each other. I really like how you kind of pointed out the cyclical nature of it and how it's like one feeds the other, saying it's okay when it's really not, Thanks for sharing. Corey, Zach, then Angelina. Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, I dropped my point in the chat. I guess I was kind of thinking that a lot of times it seems almost like, in my perspective at least, a lot of times it seems like white people want benefits of being Black without having some of the consequences of it. And I guess what I mean by that is just like, I guess although some like companies don't really market Black people as necessarily being the idealized figure, I know at least a lot of high schoolers and like social minds, it's definitely like, I guess what a lot of people think is the ideal kind of standard. And so I think that a lot of times it's like being in that kind of like a light skin especially is like very, I guess, idealized. And so a lot of times people want to achieve that without having to necessarily have to worry about a lot of the consequences on the back end, whether it's actually dealing with colorism, racism, etc. And so that's why I kind of think that it's like a way that they can kind of get, I guess, like the look, but not have to worry about any of the consequences. And you could definitely like get out of it anytime, if you feel like, oh, you can always come back to revert to, I'm actually white, I just look this way, if you know what I mean. I guess that's what I've kind of seen in my perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing. And then I know Adriana said they want our rhythm, but they don't want our blues. So, like, pun intended. That's another way of like really understanding that. So thank you. And then also, Marsha, white people have a choice. Yeah, it's like whereas people of color don't. Thanks so much for sharing, everyone. All right, we'll go to Zach, then Angelina.
Yeah, I think Inari kind of beat me to the point I was trying to make, which I think maybe part of the reason why you see some white people wanting a tan is because there's such a big industry built around beauty standards, where there's these companies that make millions and millions, even billions of dollars off of selling you a different way to look, and they don't really care what race you are. They just care that they're going to make money off of you and telling you to buy a product. So if they can make white people want to be a little bit darker, then they can sell you a tanning solution, and if they can make Black people want to be lighter, then they can sell you whitening cream. And at the end of the day, that's, their business model. So if, the beauty standards see a trend happening, then they're going to promote that trend and they're going to fuel the fire to make people want to look a different way. If everyone was comfortable with how they looked, they wouldn't make any money. So I think, there's a really big connection there. And so I don't think they discriminate in that sense. I think they're just trying to make a lot of money. And as a result, they end up hurting people along the way. But I don't think that necessarily factors into how they market. And it should, but I don't think it does.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Zach. Angelina?
I also wanted to talk a little bit about like trends, especially like how a lot of white people and like how they profit off of like a lot of like items and cultural items that you can find in Black and brown communities. Like especially like I've seen a lot of talk about it, especially through social media and on the news, about how a lot of white people benefit from selling like things like waist beads, like indigenous prints from a lot of Hispanic and Latino communities, like I've seen that a lot where like they benefit so much from like having a lot of white people buy their items, but when you see a lot of like Black owned and like a lot of brown owned businesses, they're not making any of these profits that like these white owned businesses are. So
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Angelina. At this time, I'm going to open it up to the audience. I know a lot of the audience, you've been participating in the chat or have been listening with empathy or compassionately. So at this time, if anyone would like to raise their hand or unmute themselves, feel free to share. Go ahead, Judge.
That to Angelina's point, I totally understand that, because you have people that are selling kente cloth and African cloth and can't give you the definition behind what it's all about. You know, you have African American communities that are doing debutante balls and this kind of thing with, you know, dropping the brooms and this kind of thing in marriage, and, you know, but it's, they can't tell you where that comes from and what it's all about. You know, they think it's just something that, you know, it's in our diaspora that we do. And that's something probably that we have taken from the white community with the debutante ball and all that kind of stuff, because Black people never did that before. I was in a botillion ball. You know what? We didn't do that. I'm sure we didn't have botillion balls in Africa. So where do we get that ritual from? So, I mean, it's a cross mix, you know, we take from white people, white Europeans as well. You know, I have folks in New Orleans that, you know, we did, but I came out in a botillion ball. Come out in a botillion ball, really? It's crazy. It really is. But that's a good point, Angelina. Very good point. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing, y'all. Lillian, go ahead.
I think to Judge's point, that intersectionality is really important. And I think Zach mentioned that as well. I think we grow as human beings from being with each other. And I think it's extremely important that we are now actually acknowledging all the gaps that we have missed in educating the future generations. But I think we also have to make sure that we acknowledge where there are intersections. You know, I'm married to someone who is white, and my children are always talking about both of those sides, and I want them to be proud of both of those sides. And so it's extremely important for me to talk to my kids, and so they'll talk about their Irish side or their Hispanic side and their Mayan side, and you know, that intersection is really important. You know, I was on dorm duty because it's a residential school. So I was on dorm duty last week, and I was talking to a whole bunch of the girls in the dorm about braiding, right? And so we're talking about the history of the braiding. To Judge's point, the girls didn't even realize that if you braid certain ways and certain patterns meant certain things, right? And so I was trying to explain to them that, and then explain to them that in Native American culture, that's also, you know, braiding is part of our traditions, you know, here in the US and the myriad of Native populations that we have, but also in Latin America. And so, you know, and of course, I was the brunt of a pretty awful question from an adult who said, I went with braids to work one day, and I actually had a parent ask me if I was trying to make a statement. And I was like, other than they look really good on me, I don't know what statement you want me to say, but there's a lack of education when it comes to who we are, the bountifulness of our experiences in culture. It could be from braiding, good clothing, to food, just the intersection of all of these things. That there are a lot of things that we have in Latin America that are similar to Native culture, that are similar to Black culture. You know, we might call it different things. And I think that the more we give our children, the more we give our community members this knowledge, the better off we will be in order to be able to see these things through a various lenses.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing too. And speaking of hair, I know there's texturism, especially, and I'm just going to pose this question to everybody, because I know that part of professional development and conduct, a lot of schools, and I've experienced this as well at rinks. I'm a figure skater, where people say, "Oh, well, curly hair or natural hair is unprofessional." Do you agree or disagree, or what are your thoughts on that? Because I know I feel like personally, from my experience, it's been an ongoing issue, y'all. I was first aware of it back in 1999, and it's still going on, and it's probably started even earlier than that. But what's your thoughts on is natural hair unprofessional?
I'm like, in a white supremacist in a white supremacist based capitalism, of course it's gonna be unprofessional. Because, like, that's the framework they're using. You know, what does professional really mean? Are employers ready to have this conversation? What are your values of professionalism based on? What's the history behind that? You know, I really don't like that word, because what are the biases? To me, like, bias is just racism. I'm sorry, I'm like old school like that. But I guess, you know, it's easier to the ear when you say biases. What are your biases? You know, what does it mean to be professional in a white supremacist world, right?
I find it interesting that we had to pass a law on natural hair.
Mm-hmm. The Crown Act, yeah. Like,
why? And as far as Black men are concerned, we couldn't even wear braids or fades in certain ways and that kind of thing, because we were considered unprofessional in the workplace. So what about us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then how does this play into those beauty standards of colorism that we've been talking about? I know I heard all the panelists and students and everyone here talking about these different nuances. So how does this really all come together? I see Angelina, then Adriana, and Lillian. So go ahead, Angelina.
I wanted to talk about like the importance of hair in a lot of like Native American communities, where having long hair is such an important thing, especially for men. And I learned about this in my US history class, where like during like these Indian boarding schools periods where white folk believed that if they like deconnected Native Americans from their culture, that they would be better off in like this capitalist and white society. And like I noticed that there was a lot of push for them to cut their hair, especially now, like where these standards are like if you have like long hair as a man, like you're seen as being feminine and things like that, where like boys and men are forced to cut their hair because it's so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And how it plays off in like different parts of our lives. Absolutely. Adriana?
Yes, and kind of building off of everybody's point so far, like especially Pauline's point, talking about like what is professional and how do we define professionalism? Is it to make you comfortable? Is it to enhance your comfort? Does me wearing my hair in its natural state make you uncomfortable? And why does it make you uncomfortable? What does it trigger inside of you for me, enabling me to wear my natural hair the way that it is, right? And I think that goes back to like she said, the default of them thinking that the Eurocentric beauty standard is the end all be all. You think about perms, you think about the coming back to natural hair. Like personally for me, I've been natural my whole life, and a big part of that is because of my mother. Like my mother was like, you're not getting I never thought about it because it was like just the way she socialized me, right? But like you start going to the world, you start realizing certain things, like how people treat you, how like your view and different things like that. And you realize that there is I think going even back to Judge's point earlier about like the cotillion and things like that. And I think the idea, like the difference between appropriation and the need to assimilate in order to be able to like live in this world in a way that is not always like being microaggression. Like there's certain ways in which like you talk about bleaching, you talk about getting perm, you talk about all these different things that kind of attains your certain standard, is all because we want to be able to exist in a world and be able to thrive in a world that we know is not built for us to exist and thrive in to begin with. You know what I mean? You talk about going to the job, you want to just be able to exist. But I think, yes, like wearing our hair natural is a form of deviance, is radical, because for so long it was made so that wouldn't be so, because it makes them more comfortable. But yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing, Adriana. Go ahead, Lillian.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on it, these are conversations that we haven't been brave enough to have, right? And the door has been open, and I can't be more pleased. We saw it right now in the Olympics this past summer, right? With the swim caps that were a Black-owned business for, you know, BIPOC folks who weren't accepted in the Olympics, right? We saw it with the hijabs being worn during a fencing or a running tournament, running competition. You see this a lot. And to Judge's point, we do see it in the workplace. You know, I have heard colleagues being, not at Loomis, but you know, when I worked in Virginia, when I first started teaching back in 1997, one of my first colleagues was asked if the dreadlocks were a statement, and versus the fact that he was Rastafarian. And so there's a lack of education that comes with some of these questions that are egregious and racist and completely charged. And so I think that is part, the assumption that people wash their hair every day. I mean, just little things like that. Not everyone can. And so I think going back to, as an educator, I want to take it from, I want to demystify it and decharge it, right? In the sense that I want to just talk about facts and not talk about facts to make people feel bad, but talk about facts as, you may not know this, right? And I think it is our responsibility as community members, my responsibility as an educator, in order to be able to talk about these things. And even though I teach Spanish, my kids leave my classroom constantly talking about, oh my gosh, this is not like any other Spanish class. We talk about racism, we talk about the intersectionality, we talk about the good, bad, and the ugly, as I always call it. But it is important to be able to have that freedom. And luckily I do have that freedom to be able to talk about these things. And these questions are great because I get to listen to some of these questions on a daily basis. I'm really happy that the town of Windsor is really allowing us to have these conversations. To my students' point, I just wish that these weren't all opt-in, but that they were mandatory for everyone. Like, you have to have some sort of social competence. I know that's my ideal world to have that, because those of us who are in this conversation right now, there's 23 of us, we clearly care, or we want to learn more. Windsor's a big town, and yet we are very diverse, and yet I see some of these same issues being played out in my own town. So I do want to make sure, I mean, my own children were asked if they were Hispanic, and they're in grade school in Windsor because they look white. And so I think it's important to have these conversations. So thank you.
Absolutely. And thanks so much for sharing, Lillian. I just want to highlight that because I know as an educator and teacher myself, when we speak our truths and create these common grounds and safe spaces, we now inspire others to speak their truths and to kind of find more about themselves. So thank you so much for everyone for sharing so far. I know, Sage, you had your hand up. Go on ahead.
Yeah, I just want to speak on something that Lillian said earlier about I think you said the how do you say it? The Rastafarian? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I just questioned, why is it that everyone, like, the first question they ask someone is like, oh, are you trying to make a statement? Like, why is that like the first question they ask, rather than, oh, why do you like wearing your hair that way? Or like, just something so they can be educated, because they're obviously like, confused, or like they're curious, right? And you just see that like repeatedly, like they're at like those microaggressions, you know what I mean? So it's just like, try to educate yourself. And then back to your point, like, that's something I would say for me right now. Like, I feel like all of us need to be, not us, but like like high school students or middle school students, like we need to be educated on this, like colorism early on, because there's obviously this confusion. So yeah, so thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Great point, Sage. It's really about building those relationships with each other across time and really understanding this from the ground up. So thanks everyone for sharing. Before we get to our final question, go ahead, Judge. I know you want to share.
Yeah, I just wanted to say someone brought up the point of class, and I think that's an endeavor we need to delve into as well, maybe a future conversation, because the more I sit here and stir on that, I forgot who made the comment. But that's a very serious issue as well. You know, how do we get to this point of class? And, you know, and I know in Indian cultures and Asian cultures and even Latinx cultures, Latino cultures, you know, it's a discussion of class. Now, not so much in African American cultures. I haven't found that we are categorized by class as not so much as African Americans as being middle class or low class or the lower class. You know, it's I don't know if it's really defined that way anymore for us. Perhaps I am wrong. I'm willing to accept if the young people have a comment on that.
At least in my perspective, I don't really notice it as well either. And I guess in like, well, my family's Jamaican American, so at least in our family, we don't really have any of that kind of perspective of having any class, but I've definitely noticed it in other cultures for sure. And at least I know that, I guess from a student's perspective, there isn't much of like, I guess, a kind of class barrier when it comes to colorism. I guess a lot of us, when I notice that there is colorism, I definitely notice it more in a joking way, at least like I guess best point joking way, at least in our age. But at least looking from my perspective to like kind of within African American, Jamaican American, kind of Caribbean American kind of communities, there's definitely not as much of a, I guess, class barrier as in some other cultures.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. Any other comments on race and class? Maybe we could do another kind of whole, I think I agree, Judge, we should maybe do like another event in the new year. We can start it off with that. Angelina, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about that idea of class and colorism, especially in like the Latino Hispanic community. Like I've noticed a lot, like growing up with like Mexican parents who've watched a lot of TV where a lot of darker skinned individuals were portrayed as poor or being maids and like doing that hard labor, while like white passing or light skinned Hispanics were portrayed as like being rich, having a better education than those like than their darker skinned counterparts. Like you see that a lot in like the Hispanic and Latino community, where if you're very like light skinned, you're like, people think you're successful, people think you make a lot of money, people think you're better than everyone else. While like if you're like a lot of like tanner, if you're darker, or even like black individuals in these a lot of Latino Hispanic countries, you're seen as being less than, you're like dirty to them, you're like disgusting in a way, like you're seen as being poor. Like these phenomenons of class and how they affect colorism is like very shown in the Hispanic and Latino communities.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. Adriana, go ahead.
I think really quickly, I think another thing was like with class and racism and race, I think it all ties back to like that social historical context and thinking about who was able to build wealth for centuries while at the dispossession of other people. And I think when we talk about like colorism again, and thinking about like white supremacy and how it propagates colorism, and how like wealth for a long time, because those people are the only people that are able to sustain wealth has become synonymous with whiteness. And because of that, like to obtain wealth is to like be seeking to like have closer access to whiteness. And I think in a lot of ways, like when you obtain that wealth, like this is not like a generalization, but I think that that mindset can come into play where like seeking wealth can be like thinking that you're able to like access like whiteness and the privileges that whiteness gives you. But also realizing like that's not the case because we still live in the system where of racism and how that perpetuates. So I think when we talk about like race and class, it's like interesting to see how even in that, like those systems and structures are still at play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Lillian put in the chat too, the caste system also plays into the education system and also feeds into the issue as well. I see it as like layers, as like they all are a part and they work together at times, and sometimes it doesn't work. So it's just, there's a lot to unpack with each of the variables. So thanks.
Cassie, I would also add to that access, right? That if sometimes people can be passed over for certain things because this one would be more palatable, or I can't even think about the words that people use just because they just, nauseate me. But, those are the things that, again, conversations like this are hard. Makes us feel vulnerable. It makes us feel exposed, and yet they need to happen, right? And so, and I think that while I always say, are you in this for the marathon or are you in this for a sprint? I'm a track coach, right? And this DEI work, conversations on race, moving the pendulum forward, it's a marathon, right? You're gonna get exhausted. It cannot be a race, and you have to be in it for a long haul. And you might take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but at least we're more forward than we were before. And so it is really hard and frustrating. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for putting themselves out there and being vulnerable in this space together, and for everyone to listen, to be able to grow with this.
Absolutely. And it's like a journey that we are all progressively evolving through over time. And we're going to be at different places with different parts of our identity. So thank you so much for sharing that, Lillian. Before we get to our last question, Judge, do you want to add anything else?
No, I just had a personal experience. I have a very close friend she's Korean American, and we were having a discussion on race, and she was telling me that she said, Kevin, if I brought you home as my boyfriend, my parents would be crazy. So I think it's a generational thing. She said, Kevin, if I brought you home to my parents, they would be so upset with me. I would be disowned. And I find that so interesting, because if I brought her home to my parents, they would care less. They would care less. But again, it's tradition as well. It's what the culture dictated was the traditions of the culture. So I think that needs to be reflected upon.
Yeah, how these issues transcend generations and traditions over time, right? So again, there's that other intersection between race, age, and generation. That's a whole other thing, like a whole other event. But for the sake of time, and I see a lot of folks have been writing in the chat, and thank you, Marcia, for sharing as well about race and class and how there is this white perspective that Black people are seen as poor or ghetto. And again, this is something that we can unpack continuously in our future events. But to end on a happy note, or a more positive note, I should say, what is one action you can do to disrupt colorism in your community? So thinking about the conversation that we've had, let's think about actionable steps, so that way we can leave here doing one thing. And I know Lillian mentioned, and everyone here mentioned, having these conversations. That's a great first step. But if you have any other ideas, feel free to type in the chat. Raise your hand. This is our final question before we close out for the event. What's one action you can do to disrupt colorism?
One action you can do is bring more people to conversations like this, and continue to include our young people in these conversations. But it's almost not fair to young people, because they're almost benign to all this. This comes from an older generation. So maybe we should bring more older, mature people to this talk.
Absolutely. Getting more perspectives. Thank you. And I see Adriana, focus on socialization in the family. Yep. So how we teach one another, whether it's teachers, families, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents. Yep. Excellent.
Yeah, I think that point is really important because it's easy to have this conversation with young people. It's really, I mean, I'm 47. It's really hard for me to have this conversation with my parents. You know, we're talking about 80, 90, 70-year-olds, you know, it's just really hard because you have to do a lot of uneducating, right? And so, or re-education. And so I think that is, patience is a key, but generational conversation might also be a way to approach, because as a person who does training for adults, there's always a fear of the misstep, right? Am I going to screw up? And so again, you have to meet people where they are in their journeys. And so, you know, you're not screwing up if you acknowledge that you've made a mistake, but now you want to know why you made a mistake, and so you can correct it. And so realizing that making a mistake, it's a societal thing, right? In our society, unfortunately, making a mistake is a bad thing. And we have to redirect that making a mistake is, you're able to recover from that if you're genuine and honest and want to grow from it. And so I think that's also a part of that importance.
Absolutely. I love how you can grow from the mistakes. Like, as you said, like, it's seen as a negative in our society, but it's like, well, if you fall down, you're not just going to stay down. You got to get up, and we have to keep going. So absolutely. Adriana, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. And building off of that, I think for so long we've been taught, or it's been socialized within education, school, and just in life, that like white is the default. And I think like in our education, just in everything that we see, that making sure that we are not only representing, but like making sure that we're giving true Black voices and uplifting various different perspectives of how, like, recognizing that everybody has lived their Black experience differently and lifting up all those voices in a like a really real way, and making it so that it's not like, oh, this is an extra, this is an additive, but making sure that it's a part of the holistic discussion. Like this is a part of like who we are. Like Black people are not just like this thing that exists off to the side that we come talk about like for this moment because of like this, but it's a part of like the curriculum. It's a part of the history. It's just naturally a part of like because we are naturally existing creatures and beings. Like we naturally just exist in the world, and we should be taught and explained and talk about things in that way. And though when we see things on TV, it's not like an anomaly, but it becomes a part of just the natural way of being of things. Like it's not like, oh yes, we finally have this movie that like we have dark-skinned Black female leads, but like no, we have that like in spades, you know what I mean? So I think that is like the goal in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, Adriana. Thank you.
And the other thing I wanted to add is that I think with people like you on board, if you let the town know that this was a fruitful conversation, they will look at it more and advertise it more, and we get the word out and do what we do best, which is educate. Because each one of you are educating each other and me. I'm an old fart. I'm learning from you all, and I can't do this work all by myself. So I have to have my sisters and brothers with me.
Absolutely. There's that community dynamic. Does anyone else, other panelists, students, anyone here want to share anything else before we get to have our closing thoughts and share awesome resources? Any other final closing thoughts? No? All right, great. So I'm going to share my screen one last time. Before I turn it over to closing for Judge Washington, I'm going to share a couple of resources. And again, I am going to also share this presentation in the chat as well shortly after this. So here are additional videos, questions. You can actually click on this image. This is a podcast. So if you'd like to check out intersectionality, misogyny, and colorism a bit more, you can listen. I think this might be student-led as well. There's lots more links. So thank you again to the Loomis students and Lillian for sharing this with me. And they also came up here with the self-quiz. So if you want to check this out to kind of gauge where you are with colorism, I highly recommend it. These are some excellent questions. It's 2 pages, so please check it out, kind of see where you are at as well, or share with your colleagues to have a fruitful discussion. Here are additional helpful resources. Some of these are articles, some of them are videos, some of them are books. So you will see, you can click on each of these book titles as well if you'd like to buy it on Amazon. Check it out at your local library. Understanding colorism across different cultures as well. So again, feel free to click on these. These are all clickable links. And there's even more resources. You can, because I know some friends love to see things on social media. So there are people you can follow who are doing incredible digital projects on this as well, and research studies. I know I'm going to be doing some research that has some things as well with this. And finally, I really encourage you to continue to challenge yourself by choosing to challenge yourself and take action. And action comes in many forms. There's no right or wrong way to do action. There's only ways to get better, and you continue to grow. So here is just a very short but not extensive list on things you can do to take action. So I'm now going to stop my screen share and turn it over to Judge to share some closing thoughts. Oh, you're muted, Judge. You gotta. It's okay.
I thank each one of you for being here. It's such a pleasure and honor to have you, especially to my young people. I'm in love with all of y'all. You're phenomenal. If the world were led by you, we'd be in a better place. Thank you for being a part and taking a part of this. And I respect and I adore each one of you and your thoughts. And probably in January, we'll talk about class. And I hope you all are able to join us on that, because you have made this conversation one of the best conversations we had. And Lillian, thank you for bringing these beautiful Luma students forward, because they are awesome. And Zach and all of you all are just awesome. We won't have a conversation in December because of the holidays. So this is the last one until January. You will get a notice. Also, we're having bridge builders in January as well. So those applications will be coming out. We are celebrating Black History Month, and we're doing One Book, One Winter. And we are doing this book. It's Across the Bridge, A Vision for Change and the Future of America by John Lewis. We hope you would join us in reading this, and we are going to have a discussion in February along with Black History Jeopardy. Now, Loomis has been a participant in the first year we had it.
We will be there, Judge. We will be there.
Okay, now, because Eric LaFarge bought the first team from Loomis, and they were awesome. I don't think they won, though.
But, no, I don't think we won either, but we will still be there.
I need y'all to throw down the gauntlet, okay? So get ready, get ready. So I think
we have stiff competition from the Windsor High students.
Okay,
they won it. They won it. So
okay, so I know First Church be gunning for Grace, and Grace be gunning for First for Church. So, so I'd love to see you all there. I wish you happy holidays. Stay safe. Stay masked until we get rid of them. I know I hate them, but we have to do what we have to do to get through this together. I wish you all peace and love. And